I just made it through Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler tonight. And, as much as I've been fascinated and enjoyed this 2-volume book, I've got to say it's a bit of a relief to be done with it. And the big question I'm asking myself, having finished it, is would it be better for somebody to have never read this book or to believe every concept that is propounded in this book? Because there are some wacky German idealist points that are made that are untenable for any well-educated English speaker to truly believe. There's some big questions that this book raises about the world at large and about the author and about the project itself. But just the fact that he raises so many interesting arguments makes this book a worthwhile book. And I wanted to discuss the 5 reasons why I think anybody should at least become acquainted with this book, beyond some superficial 1-paragraph summary about how it's a nihilistic take on the pessimistic dystopian future that the West will have or something. That is, grotesque to do to this 1,000-plus page book that raises so many interesting issues. But let's get into the 5 reasons why everyone should take a look at this book. And the first one is because of how much of a breath of fresh air it is from the excessive materialism of our day. Now, Spengler himself, he may be excessively idealist, perhaps excessively mysticist. I think both those criticisms could be leveled at him. But it's such a breath of fresh air in our culture. And that's why, in the answer to the question that I started this video with, I'd say you have to become acquainted with this work, even if you were going to believe everything that he sets forth therein. And I don't think you would, really. I don't know. In terms of a resource, someone I'll direct you to is John David Ebert. Now, I haven't finished his video series, his first one. He's done 2. He did one about 11 years ago. And this goes through in a 63-part series, the entire 2 volumes of Decline of the West. It's a very good introduction to the work, and I'll link the playlist below. But, there's a lot of things that Professor Ebert, I'm imagining, is his title, but, to his credit, or just as a typical 21st century Anglophone, he doesn't make much of his title, or anything. I don't know his correct title. But anyway, he's got a very sophisticated analysis in most ways, particularly with respect to art history. Now, this may be because I don't know that much about art history, but when he speaks about it, I'm very interested and almost completely convinced by everything he has to say. With respect to economic matters, both Spengler and Ebert probably don't, to a modern person from New York or London, this is childish, basically. But, and fair enough, Spengler would have choice words to say about New York and London, these cosmopolises, these world cities that he believes are where culture becomes ossified, where culture dies, and what in his terminology he calls civilization. But anyway, that's point number 1, that it's such a breath of fresh air in this materialist age, this idealism and I would say mysticism to some degree that Spengler introduces. It's very thought-provoking, and I hope to dig into that more in future videos. Now, the second point I'd bring up is the seeming accuracy of so many of Spengler's predictions. That's that's really why I think a lot of people have become more and more interested in him in recent years. And we've seen this with a number of intellectuals. I would say the most important one, and the one who, in my estimation, his esteem has risen the most in the general zeitgeist of English-speaking culture, and this is Gustave Le Bon. Gustave Le Bon, late 19th century and early 20th century French adventurer and intellectual. Now, this was the first Frenchman to go to Tibet, so he was a man of action as well as a man of letters, and he went a number of places. But Gustave Le Bon, his reputation has increased greatly over recent years, and that's largely because of a man named Matthias Desmet from Belgium. Yes, he's from Flanders, the Flemish bloke there, and he's a hell of a guy. I've got all the respect in the world for Professor Desmet. I would commend his most recent book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, to anyone listening. But he's really enhanced the reputation of Gustave Le Bon, or got people thinking about him and speaking about him again, because, he's a rightish French intellectual. Any French intellectual who has any leaning to the right whatsoever is not going to be celebrated and promoted. That's not going to happen. All right. So you have these guys who John David Ebert actually says Michel Foucault. Foucault is a kind of an heir of Spengler, or not a successor, kind of this degenerate successor of Spengler. So that's pretty interesting. But, and all those guys, they're just so... Anyway. So let's discuss some of these predictions that... And these are just a few of them, but one that particularly struck me was towards the end of the second volume of Decline of the West. He discusses that once the United States becomes a world power, its system of separation of powers will necessarily break down. And you would have to really get into his way of thinking to say, well, why does he think this is a necessity that it will break down? And that we'll have to leave to another video. But just this prediction itself rings very true, because he makes this prediction in 1922. And at that time, you already have Woodrow Wilson, who's come in. The Federal Reserve is enacted in 1913. The 16th Amendment has already been ratified. So a lot of things have happened that have been very beneficial for state power, very beneficial for actually instituting kind of a Hegelian and German statist idea in the United States. So, is Spengler a self-fulfilling prophecy there? Who knows? But after 1922, you have the second Roosevelt administration, and obviously they increased the power of the federal executive enormously and destroyed the separation of powers and federalism. The two key structural innovations of American constitutionalism were essentially dead letters by basically 1960. Now, you do have cases where the courts push back. The famous steel seizure case, where President Truman attempted to seize these steel mills in Ohio for the Korean War because there were production problems, and it was a matter of tremendous strategic concern for the United States to protect South Korea and to show the value of the American system by allowing them to prosper, while the systems that don't want to gain from Anglo-American experience find themselves in darkness and poverty. So, as a humanitarian matter, it's a tremendously good thing that we prosecuted that war to the extent we did. And, it's just a blessing that South Korea, as it is, exists today for its own culture and for the rest of the world. So I would say that. And I'm sure that's not going to be a very popular view with a lot of people because, I don't know, mentioning plain as day facts about the positive things the United States has done is frowned upon. Anyway, so that's just one prediction that's very interesting. And now you do have these conservative courts since about 1995 who first with federalism and now more and more with separation of powers. Oh, I got to get back to the steel seizure case. I didn't tell you the holding. Anyway, so Truman took the steel mills and he was saying he had the inherent executive power. And anytime you hear any government official say that their power is inherent in their function, that is bad. You do not want to allow that. Particularly the federal government, whose powers must be explicitly stated in the Constitution. But, so that was Truman's argument. And actually, you have some really good jurists who are actually somewhat amenable to something like this. Clarence Thomas comes to mind, who's actually might have gone along with Truman, and 3 justices did, and it was a badly fractured opinion. It's famous for the concurrence by Justice Robert H. Jackson. And he had a bunch of great phrases in there, but he wrote a concurrence, also Felix Frankfurter, but the majority was written by Justice Black, and it just held that no, the president cannot do this. You do not have inherent power to seize another person's property without having gone through. And they were going to pay, right? Because you've got the takings clause, but it was you cannot take control of this mill. I mean, and actually, I say he was going to pay. I mean, no, I mean he's not going to pay a market rate. He might pay something, but. It's not the same, and the owner has to go through court to get the money, so you've got transaction costs, litigation costs in this sense, or the transaction costs. Anyway, but so that's just one prediction, and even though we may be coming back, now we'll see a big test is going to be this student debt case, whether they hold that the executive can just do this because, well, the courts, nobody has standing, nobody's a proper plaintiff. Now, that's a matter for another day, but that's just one prediction. And others were, well, one of the best is even further towards the back of Volume 2. He says some things about how the media can just manufacture consent and really castigates the English-speaking press, which makes perfect sense for a man right after World War I, a German man, right? But, so maybe he's motivated a little bit by his nationality in that respect. But it was just very interesting to see him say that about the press, because everything he was saying, he was literally talking about the manufacturing consent. I've got to believe that Noam Chomsky owes Spengler an intellectual debt here. I cannot imagine that Chomsky had never read this and hadn't seen, manufacturing consent from him. Now, I've never read that book. I just know, the taglines, so maybe Chomsky even says something about how Spengler had pointed this out, but that was also interesting to see that he had already written this 50, maybe 60 years before Chomsky wrote anything. And, I mean, from my impression, basically everything insightful about that Chomskyan message, he's already stated it. And then another one was just when he calls the Western press an appalling caricature of freedom of thought. An appalling caricature of freedom of thought. In the wake of COVID-19 and the social media, the tech companies, Elon, Twitter, the switching sides about, well, it's a private company, blah, 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 and all the stupidity of all this censorship and everything. What an appalling caricature of freedom of thought it is, and that's a great Spenglerism. So that's the second reason, and maybe the best, is this guy's made a lot of predictions that seem to be pretty damn accurate. And even though a broken clock is right twice a day, I mean, this guy's been right more than twice. And this he's got, just some interesting predictions. And then this brings us into our third part, is he's got an interesting grand theory for all these. Now, I don't really buy into the whole grand theory, and I don't really come at it from a postmodernist view of like, well, I just don't believe in meta-narratives. That's not at all. I mean, I think every person who's psychologically healthy has to have some sort of meta-narrative. But, that's beyond the scope of this discussion. But the point of this is just to say that the third great reason to become acquainted with Decline at the West, maybe even buy the volumes and really dig into them, is that he's got such an interesting grand theory of history. And, grand theories are seductive, and you've got to be careful with them. I was a big fan of a guy named Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who probably many of you have heard of. And so he really turned me off to grand theories. Now, he has grand theories of his own. I maybe wasn't as perceptive about that back when the Black Swan first came out. But Taleb had a great influence on me, and he always would castigate Plato, and perhaps with good reason, but, now looking back on it, I'm kind of upset that I didn't read Plato. I didn't engage with it just based on what Taleb had said. Because, Taleb's whole thing is you never want to confuse the map for the territory itself. Just to crystallize his thought as succinctly as I could. His thought's more about risk generally, but a key part of that is, a key part of risk management is to never confuse any of your maps with the territory itself. And that's what can happen when you have a grand theory. That's what happens so often with grand theories. I mean, think of all the lunacy you see today. The vast majority of it is somebody with a grand theory who has gone off the rails because he's confused. He's looking at his map and he thinks it's the territory, and he won't stop looking at that map. But it's also good to engage with these grand theories so that you can understand that, because otherwise, you see all this nonsense that's happening, and yes, all this left-wing nonsense that's happening, and you're not going to put two and two together. You're not going to connect the dots. But you've got to actually get in there, like guys like James Lindsay have done, and engage the nonsense, because it has its own parology. That's what Foucault would call it, this parology, legitimation by parology. And that's why it's good to engage with Spengler's work. Now, not that his work is anywhere near as frivolous as the work that James Lindsay has both caricaturized in the Grievance Studies affair and gone on to critique to the great benefit of this nation, in the years following the Grievance Studies affair. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, these grand theories. You cannot get too caught up with them, and ultimately that's probably the greatest weakness of Spengler's thought and of all German thought. All German thought, the great weakness is going to be an overemphasis on systematicity, and Spengler recognizes that. So many people are like this, right? I mean, that's the old Jean de La Fontaine. Fontaine, his fable, La Besace. It's a sack that has a pouch in front and a pouch in the back. And, the pouch in the front is for everybody else's faults. The pouch in the back is for our own faults. So we see everybody else's faults much, much more easily. And And that's kind of how Spengler is, right? Just like me, probably like you as well. But it's just pretty funny because a big part of this. What's going on here? Okay, sorry, my screen just shut off on me. Okay, so it's interesting, and we can't fully get into this point, but one of these, the things that makes this book so unique, but also is kind of funny when you think about what a grand theory he's trying to come up with here. And it is a grand theory of history. That's what he sets himself. That's his ambition, is to have a theory of all of history. And that's basically what Hegel was trying to do. And I don't know that much about Hegel. That's somebody I've definitely steered clear of. And, God willing, I don't think I'll ever actually read any of his books because I'm just not interested. German statists have done quite enough to have a negative influence on my and so many other Americans' lives that I think German statists need to shut up, like, for good. So World War II did a lot of good, and it's about German statism, fundamentally. I mean, the Nazis were off the rails in 1,001 ways, and it, killed tens of millions of people, man. It's terrible. And it all comes back to German statism. These people and their conception of the state, it needs to stop. It needs to stop. It needs to stop. If you're listening with any seriousness to any European, German, French, Belgian, wherever they may be from, about any political matter, you need to run away. You need to run away because anything that they say to you is going to have a negative impact on you, okay? And it's fine. I'm just basically kidding. I would love to, discuss this with a French or a German or a Belgian or, any other guy from anywhere. I'm mostly kidding there, but if you don't take these things with grains of salt, I mean, their thoughts are very interesting to entertain. But the moment you go beyond entertaining a German idealist's thoughts, you are in grave danger. And that's why I make this recommendation of this book with some reluctance. Because, again, if you take these German statists, these German idealists, if you take what they've got to say too seriously, you're going to be going down a real bad path. And the funny thing is, Spengler points this stuff out throughout this book, but he doesn't really fully overcome it. And I mean, I guess that happens to so many, and I want to call this man an artist. I mean, it happens to so many intellectuals, so many artists, so many, different creative types, and just people generally, right? I mean, goes back to the sack with the pouch in the front and the back. And everybody else's faults are in the front and yours are in the back. You don't see your own faults. You see everybody else's. And Spengler does that in spades here, but still in a great way. That's the most interesting thing about the book, is it's because of the great ambition. It's because of the missteps that it's of any value whatsoever. He makes a lot of statements that I just can't agree with, but the work is stronger for most of those. Now, the key problem with the book is it should be about 30% as long as it is. I mean, and it's tough for me to say that because there's such a wealth of information in it. Spengler was such an erudite man. And you will just learn so much if you engage with the footnotes in this book and just look at, just really try to understand everything he's talking about, because he'll be talking about minute facts of the 2nd century BC or of 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 obscure Near Eastern religions that do not have many followers today, but that were very important in the intellectual history of the Near East. And that's what's really fascinating. But anyway, if I can finally get to my point, he makes up one of his big. He has these sets of counter concepts, Gegenbegriffe, or dichotomies is maybe. I mean, are dichotomies counter concepts? I think largely, but one of the big ones is physiognomic versus systematic. And he really chides the systematic thinkers. I mean, he really denigrates them. And he favors the physiognomic for history. But this physiognomic and physiognomy is best known as the study of the human face, largely, or just the human appearance generally, to try to make inferences about any given individual's character or internal psychic traits. And this was largely believed until about 100 years ago. And there's actually some modern studies showing that maybe physiognomy has some truth to it. But anyway, he means it in a much broader sense of the physiognomy of the culture is almost like the extended phenotype for Richard Dawkins, if you're familiar with that work, or with any of his works referencing it, or any other works that might reference it. So that would be like the beaver's dam, or things that we do, a bird's nest. These extended phenotypical traits where a species will, make these same sorts of structures again and again. And Spengler basically views each different culture as its own species to some extent. And basically, its own organism, I think he calls it. But maybe that's a big problem with his thought. Maybe he should think of it more as a speciation and less as a single organism. But who knows? Anyway, it's just very interesting because his whole physiognomic approach that he juxtaposes with the systematic, he applies it so systematically, and nothing really exists for him outside of his physiognomic approach. And to me, that's just kind of humorous. As much as it's the grand theory, just to engage with it and try to understand all this different jargon that he's using, I think is fascinating. And I guess that's what's impelled me on to finish this book and to continue to be fascinated by it and to want to get into further discussions about it, because I really want to understand what's of value in this book, because certainly there is much of value in this book, but the wheat really has to be separated from the chaff with, again, any German idealist. These are meant to be approached with the utmost caution. And anyway, that brings me to point number 4. The unique terminology and methodology. In our age of intense materialism, where, it's just really hard to get past materialist thinking, even when you want to be spiritual in this culture, even when you want to, even if it's not spiritual. For instance, I would say Gustave Le Bon, his conception of the role of ideas in the formation of cultures and in the flow of history, I think it's not spiritual, but merely idealist. He's recognizing how important ideas can be for changing the material culture around them. But fundamentally, I think it's, it's still a monist approach. He's not positing any sort of dualistic realm influencing this world. He's just recognizing what makes humans of today so different from humans 5,000 years ago, or our lives so different from them. And it's ideas, and it's how ideas have developed, and it's how ideas have motivated people, and how ideas have coordinated action. So I think Le Bon and Ian McGilchrist or John Vervaeke, maybe, these are really good guys to consult on kind of those sort of matters, I think. But this fourth reason to dig into Decline of the West is this unique terminology and methodology, this physiognomic approach. Even if you think it's bonkers and it's baffling, and there's definitely going to be some times, I mean, if you're a good reader, if you can engage with the ideas and question them as you read them, and you're writing down your questions in the margin of your page, of your book, that page of your book, and I mean, there's going to be times when, I don't know. I don't know what your reaction will be, but there's a lot to engage with and a lot to push back against with this work. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating to dig into. So I'm just going to bring up a few of these terms. Now, the most central to understanding Spenglerian terminology, and this is a big thing with guys who wrote 100 years or more ago, is what are they trying to say with a word? Because it can be totally different than what you think they're trying to say with that word. And with Spengler, the two words that feature most prominently in that respect are culture and civilization. Say for most people, those are largely interchangeable. Maybe you would say culture is broader and encompasses hunter-gatherer societies, as well as maybe pastoral nomads and agricultural or horticultural societies. And maybe you would say civilization is only once you get writing, then you're a civilization. But in Spengler's sense, it's more stark than that, we could say. And what it is he views the culture as the period of growth of any culture. And he only views there as being a handful of cultures ever, 9 total. And that could be a big weakness in his work, right? He's reducing the sample size. He's making each of these events more and more important. And the fact he's making them more important, more unified, it speaks to his mysticism that he really wants these things to just be larger than life. I mean, that is what the birth of the high cultures and their growth into the high civilizations. I mean, it's a matter. Well, I mean, nobody writes 1,000-page work about something they don't consider important, so maybe the proof is in the pudding, but he's a fascinating guy. And so the culture period, what you would call culture, and he has this analogy to the seasons, so spring, summer, autumn, winter. And the culture is basically spring, summer, autumn, I would say. Winter, maybe it's culture, maybe it's civilization. So at a certain point, he views it as becoming civilization. And the key thing that's the harbinger of civilization is the rise of the urban money economy, particularly what he calls the cosmopolis or the world city. And these kind of suck all the people and all the creative energy out of the culture, basically. I mean, that's definitely simplifying even his thought. And his thought kind of tends towards the simplistic and the gnomic or the universe, which is very strange because he criticizes again and again universalist perspectives, but he can't really get past it, I don't think. I don't know. He's fascinating. He's a much higher quality scholar than I think any living scholar you would read. And that's why I say, I mean, I'm making many critical comments about the guy. I mean, this guy has been dead for 85 years. His name still echoes on. I mean, his fame will almost, I mean, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that my name will ever be anywhere close to his name. And so I don't say any of this to bring down the great man, because what he's done is probably greater than anything I'll do, and certainly is greater than anything I've ever done up to this point. So I'd just like to make that comment and to express my profound respect for Oswald Spengler and everything he. I don't know what's the most admirable about him. Is it his ambition? Is it his erudition? But there's a lot to admire about this guy, and there's a lot to like about what he's done here and to engage with. So you've got culture and civilization, and just to learn, well, why is he using this terminology this way? Do I agree with that? I think that's a great exercise. And then he's got this other concept. This is the second specialized term that I'd like to bring up. His use of the term contemporaneous. Now, for a normal English speaker of a sufficient level of elegance, the word contemporaneous would just mean two things happening at the same time. But for Spengler, what this means is two things, and usually he speaks of contemporaneous events or people, and really more correctly I would say persons, but that's unidiomatic, just to distinguish, because a people would be like an ethnic group. It's better to say persons for two or more actual individuals anyway. So, but it's very unidiomatic. I'm sorry to give all you a fucking English lesson while we're on here, but please excuse me. So anyway, he would speak of two contemporaneous things as two things from different cultures that happen at the same phase in the culture. So you've got to get that little bit of terminology down. Well, and these, all of these are Atkinson. Atkinson was this English guy. What the hell was his? I don't remember this guy's full name, but he's a gem. I mean, this is a great work to read. Also, this isn't one of the 5 reasons, but also because I love reading works in translation because you've got the greatness of the original author plus the greatness of the translator. It's double of the greatness, double the tremendous scholarly effort to bring these fascinating ideas to you. And, I think that's a matter of, I don't know, something to be thankful for, something to feel some positive vibes about, for me at least. And so Atkinson, these are all obviously his ways of expressing what Spengler's expressed in German. And so whatever he says for contemporaneous, I have no idea. But it's two things, usually two events or persons, that occur at the same phase. And a weakness, I think, is that Spengler is so certain about these things. I mean, he's comparing, contemporaneous, decades at certain points. And you're like, really? I mean, it's that close? But I don't know. Maybe it can be produced with this physiognomic approach. But I remain skeptical after completing the 2 volumes, which I plan to reread, and I really hope to discuss more because they raise so many fascinating questions. I mean, there are so many research questions from these 2 volumes. I mean, just, questions you could devote a life of scholarship to. So this is a very rich work. And yeah, that's where I really think he's done a great service to everyone, is by asking great questions. Or, even where I think he's making mistakes, to actually be able to point out how he's actually wrong, step by step, is going to be a great exercise for your intellect, which, he might demean that. I mean, Spengler's no fan of an overdeveloped intellect. Most certainly not. He views that as a symptom of the civilizational phase, a sign of decadence. I mean, that's the classic Nietzschean view of that. But anyway, so contemporaneous, I still haven't told you. Okay. So the best example of this, I think, are that he believes that each culture has its own internal nihilism in the winter period as it becomes a civilization. And it's funny because really I think the biggest thing is the rise of the urban economy and the rise of the money power for signifying civilization. But the flip side of that is the other thing is the breakdown of the old religion through criticism, usually, well, I mean, I think he would say always by means of a nihilistic attack, basically a nihilistic attack on the traditional religion of the given culture. So the three that he really speaks a lot about are Buddhism as a nihilism of the Vedic or the Indic civilization, Stoicism as the nihilism of the Roman, or not Roman, classical, because actually the Greeks were the first great Stoics, but then you have the Roman Stoics. My favorite, Lucius Annaeus Seneca. My Latin's trash, but anyway. He's my favorite. Then you've got Marcus Aurelius, of course, and probably the much derided Cicero. I mean, even the great classicist Michel de Montaigne, he didn't even like Cicero very much. So anyway, but I'm sorry to be going off on tangents. I hope some of you are enjoying those. But anyway, so you've got Buddhism, Stoicism, and then socialism in the West. He would consider our form of nihilism, which is kind of funny because we actually have, what people consider nihilism as kind of Nietzschean thought generally. But in Spengler's view, it's really more socialism. And I think there's a lot to it. And, the fact that in 1918, I think it's in volume 1, it's either in 1918 or 1922, he predicts the downfall of the Soviet Union because he views Russian culture as actually the youngest, the one that hasn't reached the civilizational or dying or dead, really. He views it as a dead phase. So, people who are Russophiles, that probably wouldn't include me, but, I view them much less negatively than I did in 2016, I can tell you that much. So maybe Putin's doing good propaganda work. I don't know. I think his enemies are just kind of bad at propaganda work, maybe, but we'll see. Anyway, so I'm not much of a Russophile. That's not a big part of the book to me, and I think most of that interpretation is based on Spengler's admiration for Dostoevsky's novels. So think of that what you will. So those are contemporaneous periods. They don't happen at the same time, but they happen at the same phase. And that's an interesting terminological thing. And then he would view Confucianism, actually, as this in China. And the key with Confucianism is Confucius wants to respect all the outward forms of Ren, this classic way that you're supposed to treat one another, kind of dignity. I used to study Chinese quite a bit, but I have not in many years, so my classical Chinese is atrophied quite severely. And anyway, but for Spengler here, the point is that Confucius doesn't believe that these ceremonies are of any deeper metaphysical significance. He just views them as important for keeping Chinese society together. And, there's a lot of consonance between that sort of view and maybe, I'm not sure if this is Jordan Peterson's actual view, but I think a lot of people interpret his view as basically, well, let's say Brett Weinstein. This is definitely Brett Weinstein's view, that religion is valuable for us. It's useful for us. We So Brett would say, as an epistemological matter, we can know that this is valuable because people are expending resources on it significantly, but it has not been selected out of the population. So he's a classical Anglo-American Darwinist. I think Brett Weinstein's an extraordinary guy. I think there's a lot of extraordinary biologists out there. Spengler's not too hot on Darwinism, and I think that's a real weakness of the book. He's too monolithic with his approach, Spengler is. He's not willing to even countenance anything outside of this physiognomic framework that he's developed. And that's the real weakness of the book. But just to engage with this wacky terminology and this whole thing that he's developing is really something. So that's contemporaneous. Those are different things. And then he views like Muhammad and Cromwell and Pythagoras as contemporaneous Puritan movements, or, Puritan leaders of Puritan movements in, respectively the Western, as he calls it, the Magian, the Arabian civilization, or the culture at that point, not quite the Arabian civilization coming very shortly after that with Muhammad. And these Puritan movements come, just a few hundred years, in Spengler's framework, just a few hundred years before the civilizational phase begins. So those would just be some different contemporaneous periods. And then the third bit of terminology, just to, briefly discuss here. I mean, these are not exhaustive expositions of the depth of these concepts, but I think they're serviceable. So, take, to whatever extent they benefit you, please use. Anyway, the third one is the Pseudo-Morphosis. Now, this might be the hardest concept. I think it's just a bit of terminology I'd like to bring up. And here, maybe you can criticize Spengler because he's kind of mixing metaphors. So Pseudo-Morphosis is a geological phenomenon, where I'm not a geologist. I'm not a biologist. But a pseudomorphosis happens. Basically, something happens with these rocks in this formation, right? And it makes these rocks look like they're another rock. Why it does that, how it does that, I don't really know. And I'm not sure that Spengler knew like that well. Now, and I don't mean to demean his knowledge about anything, because the way he discusses things like mathematics and art history in Volume 1, very, very impressive. And I actually wish I had read the second chapter in the work is all about mathematics. And you're thinking, what? Well, how is this about math? This is a history book. And that's exactly the brilliance of the book, I would say. But his discussion of math was actually helping me understand some of my own, what do I want to say? My own limitations with mathematical thinking. Because I have a lot more of like the classical number feeling, as he would say, number feeling, as Atkinson translated it, which is his conception. There's a ton of these kind of hyphenated, doofy words, world feeling, number feeling. I mean, and this guy will just say the most mystic, nonsense, gobbledygook sentence, and you're just like, dude, like, how? Like, it is just like the height of self-indulgence and decadence. And hey, a guy who's gone on as many tangents as I have, I probably know a thing or two about self-indulgence and decadence, okay? But, I mean, this freaking guy. And you're just sitting there and you're just like this, there's so many interesting arguments and lines of inquiry this guy goes down. And then he's just got to pop off on this just like airy-fairy, just like go back to the freaking Teutonic forest, you freaking... Anyway, Not the Teutonic forests are probably that bad in the right circumstances, I imagine. Buchenwald might not be the nicest one, but I don't mean to make light of the sad fate that anyone, suffered there. It's grisly stuff. Anyway, so you've got these pseudo-morphoses, which, maybe it speaks to the fact that he's mixing metaphors. Maybe it speaks to the sloppiness. There is, when you write 1,000+ page book that spans as many interesting ideas as this, probably some serious sloppiness is going to slip in there. And I think it does throughout. So that's what I would say, as a caution. But the pseudo-morphosis. So this is a central concept because nothing else is going to make sense without this. And there's a few concepts like that. And that's the other very interesting thing, to go back to point 3, the grand theory point, is when you have a grand theory like this, there's going to be so many assumptions, axioms, presuppositions, postulates, whatever you want to call them. There are going to be, I think the best word is probably axioms. There's going to be things you have to assume to get your system off the ground. You can't have any system of symbolic logic, of any sort of inference-making system that doesn't have axioms, any sort of analytical system that doesn't have axioms. And so his system has a lot of axioms, and I think that's one of the things. Well, he probably doesn't view them as axioms. He views them as things that he's proven through his thinking, through his physiognomic approach of comparing the morphologies of these civilizations and cultures. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced about a lot of them. So maybe he wouldn't view some of them. But the pseudo-morphosis, I think it has to be an axiom. Because, he explains why he makes this assumption. He explains why he raises this metaphor. But there's no way to prove that this is valid and that this is the correct approach. Anyway, the pseudo-morphosis is important because now you're going to have what you could call homologous structures in these different cultures that could look like they were the same thing. Now, the best example, or the biggest example, would be the Christian church, because there have been several pseudomorphoses with the Christian church in Spengler's conception. And the most important, I guess, there's a lot to the concept, and it's just, I don't want to get too deep into it, because I just want this to be about why you should dig into the book and not get lost in the weeds, but I feel I've done a poor job fully explaining the pseudomorphosis concept. And the idea is that you can have something like the Christian church and its doctrines, the Bible itself, and it can mean vastly different things within a different culture. And again, he doesn't think there's many different cultures. He wouldn't view French and German as different cultures. He does and he doesn't. And that's the other thing. There's a bit of a Mott and Bailey, or a kind of, I don't even know if it's strategic equivocation as much as it's just sloppy equivocation. In that he's like, well, there's really only 9 cultures, and, but then he's got this work that he does between the 2 volumes, Prussianism and Socialism or something, I don't know, where he's butthurt about World War I, reasonably enough. The Treaty of Versailles, the Allies were dishing out some rough stuff there, and, it's regrettable. I don't think there's anybody who's a fan of Anglo-French foreign policy in that period. Certainly not the self-hating Britons themselves, I know that. Ask a Scottish man what he thinks about those machinations. Jesus. You ever watch those videos of like these Scottish soccer announcers in like 1960s? You're like, Jesus, dude. Like, these guys hate England. Like, you are a joke. Or have you seen the one of Maradona's Hand of God video? And it's just like, yeah, it's clean goal. Like, I'm not going to try to do a freaking Scottish accent, but I mean, these guys, they are still pretty angry, and I guess it has a lot to do with all the alcohol and the fry-ups. Anyway, I love Scotland. I love Scottish people. But, I'm pretty Anglophile, so, I mean, my last name's Smith at the end of the day. Come on. Blood's thicker than water. But, so he wouldn't view the Scottish and the English certainly as different cultures. I mean, he doesn't even really view England as having a culture. This is another kind of problem, because he's got his big grand theory, and then he's trying to make these kind of ad hoc, kind of definitional exceptions, these kind of epicycles, one could derisively say. But just to engage with this terminology, to try to understand, why does he think these things? So, back to the Christian church. Jesus, can I stay on point? So, when it first arises, it's a product of the Magian springtime. In his view, as any good European, I believe, should think, it was the greatest expression of the Magian springtime. Now, whether you live in the Near East, I don't know if you might believe that. But, well, I don't know. Yeah, you'd have to be acquainted with Spengler, but Islam's actually a product of more of the summer. Yes, certainly the summer, and not quite the autumn. You've still got the strength in Magian culture. He views the spring and the summer as that's when you've really got creative force. But anyway, so the church is created then, but he views it as even before Constantine. This was wild to me. He views it as that Diocletian. When I first read this, I said, what? I almost put down the book. What? He says Diocletian is the first caliph. The first caliph. But he made a kind of an interesting argument for it. It's actually really fascinating. I mean, I think the reign of Diocletian, or the reforms of Diocletian, is one of the best pieces of evidence that Spengler mounts for kind of his theories generally, but certainly for the Pseudo-Morphosis, because Diocletian basically turned the eastern half of the Roman Empire into a feudal nobility, which you would expect to be the corresponding estate form in the springtime of a culture. So that's interesting, that's got that consonance with Spengler's theory. But the other thing, he says Diocletian is the caliph. So how is that? Well, because he views a Magian civilization as kind of fundamentally existing under a religious consensus that the ruler... I would need more time to really get deeply into that. But anyway, and he views the Pantheon as the first mosque, which... I don't know enough about art history to truly verify that, but it's a fascinating notion, and you do look at a lot of, that kind of the Moorish architecture in Spain that's so beautiful, and, a lot of architecture that I really like, really, really like, and maybe it is characteristic of the Magian world feeling and of the Arabian civilization. But he really views the Pantheon with its this kind of domed roof with the eye going through as a great symbolic representation of the Magian world feeling for reasons that are beyond the scope of this discussion. But so then the Christian church in the West is basically Magian for a little while. I don't, maybe it never really gets it, but he views the Byzantine and the Islamic caliphates, and then later the sultanates, the Seljuk Turks, and then the Ottoman sultanates. He views all that as all part of the Magian, and the big one there is the Byzantines, because a lot of people wouldn't agree with that. Probably the most famous English Anglophone study on the Byzantines is probably, what's his name, Edwin? I believe it's Edwin Luttwak. Very interesting book about the grand strategy of the Byzantine Empire. And maybe he's got the better of the argument. I don't know. It would certainly be a more modern argument. I think that Luttwak is propounding more of a Machiavellian kind of realpolitik, lionizing the Byzantine Empire, really congratulating them for existing for another 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire. But for Spengler, now is he backfitting his model to the data? I mean, there's a big question there with Spengler. But in his conception, it would be predictable that the Byzantines would outlast the Western Roman Empire for that long, because the Western was still basically a classical civilization that had basically died. Maybe you're getting some Magian into there with, certainly with the cults of Mithras and even Julian the Apostate, and certainly Constantine and all these fellows. But it doesn't really take hold. And he views these civilizational and then what he calls kind of a post-civilizational period as really lacking internal form and lacking any sort of historical pulse, you could say, or any sort of internal coherence of what's happening. The only thing that matters in this post-civilizational phase is that an economic resource has developed this civilized population here. And it still has technical knowledge, and it still, couldn't be a source of wealth for the people who fight over it. So that's what happens in the Western side. So the church, the Roman Empire, and with it the church fall in 476, basically. I mean, the church goes on, but, it's certainly not the later papacy that becomes strong. And then kind of you have the Pseudo-Morphosis with basically Charlemagne, I would say. He's the biggest figure you could look at as kind of a key person in it, I think, or an early personage. So this is the rise of the Faustian culture, as Spengler would call it, the Western culture. The Faustian culture is basically in its springtime about Charlemagne and guys like that, the Carolingian period. And now with the Holy Roman Empire, you've got this kind of second pseudomorphosis of a Christian institution. So the first one is, you have the old Pontifex Maximus and these official Roman state religious organs that get turned into Christian institutions. And even before they're turned into Christian institutions, they still already have a Magian feeling, because that's the strong culture in the Mediterranean at the time, the one that has not yet reached its period of senescence, you could say, its period of old age. So that's pretty interesting. So the first one happens with these Roman institutions that become Magian in the second half of the empire. And then they kind of keep going on, and what keeps them going on is the Magian, because now you've got the Roman Catholic Church, which is an independent force from this fallen empire, but not much of one at first. And then the Faustian world feeling comes into it, and it's expressed through the Crusades and things of that nature, way beyond the scope to fully go in to that right now. Anyway, so that's, I think those are all of them. Well, then there's the third, in Spengler's view, is Russian Christianity. He views Dostoevsky's Christianity as a third world feeling applied to Christianity. So you've got these three Christian pseudomorphoses, but it can happen with different things. Maybe an example might be... this one's, well, I think it's all right. I don't think he emphasizes it much, but it stood out to me while I was reading another book the other day was, Zoroaster and Avestan, the language he wrote in, the Gathas or Gathas, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the oldest part of the Avesta, the most important religious text in the Zoroastrian religion, written in a language very similar to Old Indic, and more importantly, it refers to all the gods of Old Indic. And, but in Zoroaster's conception, they're all demons. So there's kind of a proto-Gnostic thing there, where Gnosticism, as you may know, kind of takes Yahweh from the Old Testament and turns him into a thing called the demiurge, which just means the creator. And he's just kind of like this dopey, like, little god who doesn't actually know that much, and just, he was trying to do something weird in these crazy realms, and then he created the physical world that's imprisoning us all. That would be the Gnostic idea. But, so it's a reinterpretation of this other god. And those would both be Magian. Now, in Spengler's conception, now, I don't know how he really views the Old Testament, if he views it as, like, pre-Magian. I mean, there's a lot of, for all the ink he spills with all this rhetoric and this cosmic flowings, and I mean, anyway, for all that, he's got so many gaps in everything he's got to say, and that's as much an indication of his ambition as anything, and that's to be commended. But there's a lot to be desired with a lot that this guy's got to say. And yeah, I don't know, man. German theoreticians, there's something went very, very badly wrong over there at some point, and it happened a long time before 1933. 1933 and everything that happened between 33 and 45, it was just a symptom. It's a symptom of an underlying sickness in German culture. This sickness has not been cured. You see the fucking stupid solar panels everywhere. You see the fucking stupid windmills. I don't want to get off on some rant against these neo-Malthusian idiots. These neo-Malthusian, how are you still Hegelian idiots, right? I mean, just to even broach these subjects, you just almost just want to fucking, like, I don't know, man, maybe just drink, I don't know. Maybe it's good for the beer sales. All these just complete idiots who still think the government is going to do something positive. Okay. Anyway, sorry. I mean, these tangents, I'm pretty mad at myself at this point, but I don't know. I hope some of them have been entertaining. I mean, it's a worthwhile subject matter, and that's why part of me, I'm like, well, go, you German theoreticians. I mean, this is some crazy stuff you're talking about. It's pretty stimulating, but there's a lot of crazy, stimulating stuff out there that you got to be careful with. And German philosophy might be chief among them. Because the Buddha said, there's nobody can hurt you more than your own mind. Anyway, so that's kind of a discussion of the unique terminology and methodology. A very insufficient, a very cursory, a very introductory discussion. But I'd be happy to discuss with anybody further and anybody who would like to listen. So I'm sure I'll come out with more after this about those. But that leads us to our fifth and final point, which I've already kind of touched on. But the importance of history as a concept in German idealisms. And, pluralizing an ism word isn't exactly the most idiomatic form of English. I'm cognizant of that. But I think it's the only correct way to speak of these. And I guess I already did it earlier, speaking of the nihilisms of the civilizational phases of each culture in Spenglerian thought. And yeah, that's obviously quite an interesting thing, those nihilisms. And the different forms of German idealism, these different German idealisms are also quite fascinating, if only in their repugnance, ultimately. But, these ideas, they wouldn't have done so much harm in so many places. I mean, these ideas that come out of Germany and France have and Spengler says this, he's speaking more about Deutsche Technik when it comes to this, about German technology, and he was not just speaking about German technology. I just say that jokingly, because, they're, der Weltmeister in many industries. The Mittelstand was, I'm not sure anymore, but at one point kind of the envy of many people around the world, a very strong industrial base. So, German accomplishments in technical fields are certainly not to be sneezed at. Perhaps not as great as the Anglo-Americans, but, we Germanic-speaking peoples do stick together sometimes. So, anyway, they're very important, these German ideas, and they're very powerful, These terrible things happen over in places like Russia and China, and it all comes from a German guy. Of course, right now I'm speaking of Karl Marx, this complete sore on society and humanity, and you just wonder how people can continue to believe these just utterly childish notions, and I don't mean to speak so condescendingly. It's not charming, and obviously that's part of the name of the game here. I'd like the substance to be much more important than the form, but I don't want to come out here and be a totally abrasive guy any more than I just naturally am. So, I'm not just trying to beat up on them, but these ideas have had tremendous and negative consequences all over the world. We need to understand them. We need to understand what's the appeal of these German idealisms, and the importance of history as a concept in them is a central reason why you should read Oswald Spengler, or why you should engage with the work, because his whole work is about how do we really define history? And really, you could say it more of how do we define historiography? In my view, that's really where Decline of the West is a stimulating work. We can at least say that much. It's a truly inventive work of historiography. The inventiveness of the historiography is artistic. It has reached an artistic level, for better and for worse. And when you look at the role that the history plays in Hegelian and Marxian thought, you really want to understand how these demons from Central Europe, and I say that more in the sense of daimon, but these German daimon, they're nasty, man. They're nasty. It's a shame. But that goes back to point 3. These grand theories, there's a seductive and a hypnotic quality about them. And that's what's fascinating, but that's what you've got to be careful about. You cannot get hypnotized by these ideas. And you will, man. They are mesmerizing. There's a mesmerism in the most derogatory sense of the term. And that would be something that Gustave Le Bon would really agree with, I think. I'm completely taking the idea from him. He's the guy. Gustave Le Bon can say more with 1 page than Oswald Spengler can say with 100 pages. That's a fact, okay? So the Frenchman needs to get his due. And that's all I want to say about that, I guess. I'm not trying to, but, the extent to which I mean, I'm a guy, and again, I mean, you're hearing it right now with all these tangents. I can be a prolix guy. So I'm mindful of that, and that's something I need to forgive other people for, as much as I would ask them to forgive me, or, to at least hear me out. And that's why I read the whole fucking book, right? That's why I read both volumes, because I'm not going to sit here and criticize the guy unless I've read everything in there. And I got his two later books that have been translated into English. He had one that was incomplete. Can you say it? Uncompleted at the time of his death? Incomplete? There's probably better grammar there, but... So he didn't complete one of his books, which actually would have been a fascinating book. It's called... Frühzeit der Weltgeschichte, the dawn of world history, and it just looks like a fascinating book. So that's where he's actually trying to understand the genesis of each culture, which is something he kind of waves his hands at, and I kind of respected that. I mean, this is something I want to get into in a later video, but to the extent his approach is epistemologically motivated, I think there's a lot to like about Spengler. To the extent it's ontologically motivated, this guy sucks. Like, this guy's a piece of shit if ontology is motivating him. But if epistemology is, I think there's a great... If he's got parsimonious hypotheses that can explain these phenomena, I'm all ears. And that's why I was all ears, and that's why I'm going to continue to be all ears about this guy, because I haven't gotten to the bottom of this. And this guy is too weighty and too interesting to dismiss just because of, there's a lot of mistakes in there. And it would be very easy. I mean, what kind of a person, what do I want to say about the person who would just dismiss Oswald Spengler out of hand? Not a friend of mine. I don't think, there certainly would be many who would be a friend of mine day to day, right? Who wants to make bad relations with other people? To the extent I can manage good relations with people, I'm not going to... I don't think you'd believe me if I if I told you I had all this great charm and was a very popular fellow. Very popular fellows generally don't have time to read Oswald Spengler, but so so I'm not just trying to go out of my way to be disagreeable here. Let me say that much. But there are so many concepts that this guy just tosses out in this book. And that, to the extent that they're necessary for his conclusions, that's very bad. because there's a lot that needs to be cut. There's a lot that needs to be cut here, man. Like, there's just a lot of just dog shit. God, well, gosh, now this is a very weird thing to randomly bring up, but that Adam Sandler movie from about 2006, I believe it's called Click. He gets the remote control. He can, fast forward through life, or through the bad parts of life, but it's an AI system. So it learns the things that he would fast forward through, and it fast forwards through them for him. Okay? And I use that as a way to kind of be a metaphor for the danger here with Spengler, is even when he's just saying, stuff that to me, I'm just like, dude, no, are you surprised that the Nazis could misread you? That's the thing. When he's, coming out, to his credit, unlike a guy like Heidegger, who, these postmodernists, just nut jobs, actually think, so highly of, who basically was a Nazi or something. Heidegger does not seem like much of a admirable fellow at the end of the day. So, Spengler, to his credit, at least didn't go along with the Nazis. But the idea that this guy wouldn't think that he would be misread so grotesquely, when the more you write, the more easily you can be misread. Just like me, where I'm going off on all these tangents. Probably the easier it would be to misunderstand me. And probably the easier it is. And for that, I apologize to myself. No, I apologize to you guys as much as to myself. But anyway. So you don't want to just try to fast forward through all of it and through the bad passages, because even when he's in a bad passage, there could be a footnote about something fascinating that could be a seminal for a research question, or maybe seminal's not the right word there, but very stimulating for a research question. There's all sorts of different things, and just tidbits, things you wouldn't know. I mean, things that are, to the extent you value erudition, reading every page of Oswald Spengler is going to be a beneficial exercise for the growth of your own erudition. That's a fact. So, as much as I criticize so many different passages and different concepts, to engage with them and actually understand them and actually be able to reject them in your own words, actually understanding why you're rejecting them, is going to be a great exercise for your own intellect, to the extent you value that. And again, Spengler predicted, the guy sounded like Neil Postman. The things Neil Postman was saying that were so prescient, were so perspicacious, so incisive in the 1980s, the 1990s. The most famous book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in 1985, I believe. Fascinating book. And this is another one that's a thin volume that you can get a lot out of. And those aren't to be sneezed at. I think a tome like this, well, like I say, I got a lot of time. I got a lot of time on my hands. So, I like to dig into this stuff. But to the extent, if you don't have that much time on your hands, pick up Neil Postman. That's a real good one. But more so, pick up Gustave Le Bon. It is tremendous. That's really a tremendous work. And Ian McGilchrist. Now, Ian McGilchrist is going to be a tome. But Ian McGilchrist, he's kind of an Englishman who very much respects German idealism, but doesn't accept it hook, line, and sinker. Whereas, sometimes with John Vervaeke, it kind of, I don't know. Like, his discussion of, like, a guy like Meister Eckhart, I think is, like, unalloyed, like, praise. There's, like, no discussion of, like, the dark side of, like, German thought with Vervaeke as much. I don't know. I need to go through Awakening from the Meaning Crisis again and some of his other works. I don't know. Vervaeke hasn't been speaking to me that much recently, in the metaphorical sense. He's never, in fact, he's never once directly spoken to me. I don't know the guy. Actually, no, he did. He did actually once, but via, YouTube comments. He's a really good guy, I think. I think, and a fascinating guy. But Ian McGilchrist, the depth of his scholarship, I think Professor Vervaeke would be the first to admit, like, McGilchrist is the man. So, as much as this is 5 reasons to read Oswald Spengler, and I think that's what you should do, 2 shorter works that I would really recommend are Gustave Le Bon, The Psychology of the Crowd, or is it just called The Crowd? It's La Psychologie de la Foule. I'm not sure. But, and the other one would be Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. But those are very short. And that's the good thing about short works, as I say, on this rambling torrent of tangents here. I want to tie it back actually in with my fifth point and actually go somewhere with my discussion, unlike Spengler at many points in these two volumes. I certainly haven't gone off on as many tangents. Well, I don't know. It certainly does seem unfocused at times. There are times in Decline of the West where you're just like, dude, I don't know, though. Like I say, there's that click phenomenon there that you want to be aware of, because if you're trying to fast forward, through the book to kind of mix verbs and God damn it, this is rambling as hell. Please forgive me. Anyway, so I wanted to just bring that back to this is a work of German idealism focusing intently on history. And the word history, we just can't underestimate the importance of Geschichte, of history, in the German philosophical psyche. Because, and in all these deformed, and I've had some harsh words, obviously. I'm not sure if they're quite harsh. Less than complimentary words for German idealism and the practitioners thereof. Now, why do I have such hard words? Well, anyone who lives in the United States of America in 2023 and doesn't realize how much harm German idealism has done to this country is not very well educated, or is severely miseducated. And that's very regrettable. And so, beyond just the material harm that the Nazis did to the United States. And, yes, we kicked their asses. Okay, we saved everybody. And, the Soviet Union lost a lot of people. But, without Lend-Lease, without American muscle, things wouldn't have turned out the same way. A lot of good men lost their lives. Whatever. But that was pretty negative. And that was all a result of German idealism. Nazism just doesn't fucking happen without it. It just doesn't come if you don't have this underlying substratum of complete dog shit philosophy that has enslaved a lot of psyches over a lot of time. But anyway, so German idealism, it's just a beast that cannot be fed, because it kind of leads in, and you've got people who are going, well, the postmodernists are different, and Marxism, that's not idealism, that's materialism, that's scientific materialism. It's a complete bullshit. Real communism has never been tried. But it's laughable, very, very laughable matters. But, so you have German idealism, you've got its kind of retarded cousin, Marxism, and then Marxism is a complete intellectual and material failure. But, scholars aren't really very smart people, so then you have all these kind of, I don't know. I'm thinking of some of these guys actually do have some good ideas. A lot of these French guys, whom I would really like to castigate. I have not read enough of their stuff. But it's my understanding that a lot of the stuff they say actually is pretty smart. So one I would say is Jean Baudrillard. I think... James Lindsay has had a lot of praise for some of his ideas, and certainly for the concept of the hyperreal, certainly for his ideas kind of building on Spengler, building on Chomsky about kind of this hyperreality created by the media to manufacture consent, for things like the Iraq War. And maybe there's something in Jacques Derrida, or Jacques Derrida, or whatever, but I'm not much seeing it. Even then you've got guys who were a little bit older who actually, some of what they did was decent, some of it was not. Like Ferdinand de Saussure. That wasn't a very good one, but my pronunciation. Anyway, a lot of these, I'm sure, any francophones, I think they might like it, though, because I kind of like my accent. But anyway, so he was a Swiss, but as you can tell from the name, from the French part of Switzerland. And he actually had some very interesting and good ideas, particularly with respect to the philology of Proto-Indo-European. He made a great contribution to that. Very counterintuitive, very interesting. Basically, he proposed that there was this lost consonant in Proto-Indo-European, and that its position there had influenced these other vowel sounds that became different, and it really united, or it harmonized a lot of Proto-Indo-European philology, which is a fascinating subject. And again, so many Germans, this obviously was a French-Swissman, but so many Germans have been the greatest philologists. So again, I mean, it's a tremendous nation that has contributed so much to philosophy, but it just needs to be handled with care by Germans themselves, as Nazism and, this kind of just neo-Malthusian death cult that's kind of going on right now. So that's very negative, and that's what's hurting Germany itself. But these ideas have so much harm outside of Germany, and that's really what there's never been a reckoning about since World War II. They sensationalize the shit out of it, and that's going to happen when you find places like Auschwitz and Buchenwald. I mean, that's going to be sensationalized in the most negative sense possible. I mean, atrocities of that nature are. It's insane, but it's almost like Nazism is the least of it. And somebody's going to hear, I mean, this guy says Nazism is the least of it. Oh my God. Beep, 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 beep. Obviously, I'm not quite saying that. I mean, I don't, I'm not here having a seance trying to fucking get Himmler to come here and fucking rub my shoulders or something. But, I mean, these guys, they were idiots, and their ideology takes on such a hateful cast, which is terrible. I mean, once you take on a hateful cast, that's where things are going to get really negative. But it's so much deeper than that. It's so much deeper than that. So much deeper than that. But you look at all this idiocy that comes from the continent of Europe. It doesn't come from the United Kingdom. It doesn't come from the United States. All the truly idiotic ideas that come out of Europe come out of Germany and France. That's it. Some come out of Belgium, some come out of Switzerland, but it's anything that is in the orbit of Germany and France. We have to treat these ideas with the utmost skepticism. We have to, almost take a Pyrrhonian stance towards them. Pyrrho, in my view, kind of a great Greek philosopher. I don't think a guy like Spengler would care much for him, because Pyrrho, he doesn't mention him much, but I thought Pyrrho would be a really good example of kind of the nihilisms of the Greek world. Because I think Pyrrhonism is actually another nihilism instead of Stoicism. I mean, it's just a more radically skeptical, I don't know. But Pyrrho, he's really interesting because he actually went to India with Alexander's army, and he met the gymnosophists, and there was a tremendous cross-pollinization, or what a freaking, why does that word have to be that long? But in Central Asia and India at that time, that was probably the best, the most interesting culture in the world. Existed in the Indo-Greek kingdom and in the Greco-Bactrian kingdom for about 100 years. Fascinating time. Early period of the Silk Road, of course. Anybody who Amu Darya, Sir Darya, these river valleys. The Oxus River, the Araxes. No, not the Araxes, the Jaxartes. But Anyway, and those were tremendously anglicized Greek pronunciations. Yeah, I'm not gonna work on that. I don't even know where the hell would J come from? Is that like an iota at first? Probably. anyway, okay. But yeah, so history is such an important concept. In fact, James Lindsay calls this the kind of theological concept, the concept of God, for so many of these. I mean, it's just almost tough to even describe these American offshoots of German idealism and of postmodernism. And yes, they are largely Marxist. I mean, who knows how much of James Lindsay's focus on the word Marxism is branding, is neurolinguistic programming. I mean, I don't think he's into that. I was watching this guy, Matt Arrett, who's a very interesting fellow who I would not believe I wouldn't believe much of what this guy has to say about, like, world politics. I would not take those with much credence, but he's got an interesting perspective. He's a guy I'd like to discuss a lot more at a future point. But he was talking a lot about whatever I just said about James Lindsay. What was he saying? I saw him on Courtney Turner. She had I only found out about Courtney Turner because she interviewed James Lindsay and Stephen Coughlin and some other guy in a different one. Those were really good. Especially Coughlin, which I don't know why the hell he pronounces his name Coughlin. Like, anybody with that last name pronounces it Coughlin. But, I mean, anybody I've ever met, but whatever. But his name's Stephen Coughlin. And so yeah, he was really good on there with James Lindsay. And that's how I found about this Matt Arrett guy. And I'm trying to think of what the heck he was saying that I was thinking about just now, but I think that's gone for tonight. But anyway, he was saying things about neurolinguistic programming because Matt Arrett is like imagine that, like, Howard Zinn and Oliver Stone like had like an orgy with like a Chinese spy and then they had a kid, and somehow the kid like had sperm from like both Oliver Stone and Howard Zinn, and then the egg of this Chinese spy. That's Matt Arrett. He's who that egg grows up to be. But a fascinating guy. But his Marxist sympathies are very strong, and I've never heard him say one word, even like realistically, like negative about China. Like even just like acknowledging like a strategic limitation on China or any sort of less than sterling moral act that the People's Republic of China might have committed at some point in time. I mean, might have committed. Which, I mean, of course, the People's Republic of China, I mean, they don't do anything bad to anyone, and they never have. But putting that to one side, he was talking about, like, neurolinguistic programming as, like, something the elites do. And I don't know that much about it. I'm not really into hypnotism and stuff like that, but I actually have been trying to learn more about it just because, you know, it's one of those things that like a midwit or, you know, just a normie or any of these other kind of dismissive, pejorative terms, which we shouldn't overuse. And we definitely want to hear what these guys have to say, but at the same time, sometimes normie and midwit is kind of the only way you can describe these people. Anyway, you know, they would hate something like hypnotism. I mean, the idea of these sorts of things just really is repellent to them. So it makes me want to learn more about these things. So I was looking into it a little bit, but I don't know anything really about it. But I do wonder if kind of this branding use of Marxism with James Lindsay is somewhat of a, neurolinguistic programming or something. Because obviously, Marxism, the extent you can tie things to that, it's just a discredited ideology. If you're not miseducated, and if you're not miseducated, it's a discredited ideology. It's just laughable. You've got Matt Ehret there. So this guy Matt Ehret, I just got to bring this up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I wanted to do a standalone video about this guy, and I will at some point. But he's sitting there in this interview, and he's talking about FDR, and he's like, talking about, we're not sure if Churchill poisoned him so that he could create the Cold War. And it's like, Stalin told FDR's son before he died, he thought Winston Churchill did it. And it was like, for Matt Ehret, like, that was like conclusive proof. Like, hey, Joseph Stalin said Winston Churchill probably killed FDR. Quoterat demonstrandum, baby. Like QED. Come on, dude. Like, come on, dude. Anyway. Stalin said he did it, dude. Stalin said Churchill did it. I don't think you need any further inquiry after that. Anyway. So history is like a god to these Marxist kind of punks, right? These guys, can you grow up? You're still a Marxist? Like, how often does this have to fail? Like, how many times does this have to just completely run off the tracks and just screw so many people before you just all just shut up? Just like, I don't know, Anyway, but, So in fact, James Lindsay, one of his big things, and I'm completely with him on this, is that he thinks within the conception of the word religion, or establishment of religion in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, that this term should comprehend pseudo-religious ideologies like Marxism. Anyway, a key part of James's argument there is the word history, and its kind of importance as a sort of god for these Hegelian thought systems. And, with Spengler, it really hasn't become reified into just these kind of, like, strange, like, essentialist totems and taboos of the modern woke, which, is a word I didn't really want to use in this video. Not a word I like using, not people I like interacting with, not people whose existence I like to remember. Can they handle that? Oh my God, he's just erasing us. If I could, I'm not trying to harm any of these people, but if I could, just wave a wand and they would all be gone from the world with no suffering, I don't know, man. That would be a really, really tough decision. That would be a really tough decision. If just all the nonsense could just be gone. And I don't want these people to suffer needlessly. They cause themselves so much needless suffering. It's kind of a Buddhist idea, but I don't think you can controvert it. A wokey causes himself more suffering than you could ever cause him. That's a fact. These people, just to live in this world of just complete falsehood and just complete idiocy and self-righteousness. It's really sad. And I used to be one of them, kind of. I never was on the furthest left, but I was as true blue as they come, man. It was a big part of my identity being what the hell was I saying? My T's were way too crisp there. It was a big part of my identity being a Democrat back in the day. But man, it's just sad. It's just sad for anybody who was proud to be a Democrat. And I shouldn't, I mean, the fact that I was ever proud to be a Democrat, I was a very, very poorly educated and a very, very severely miseducated young man. I was a very good mark and quarry for the communists when I was a young man, because my mind had been bludgeoned by the stupidity of the American university system. And I'm finally kind of waking up against that. Going to law school was a very big help with that, but not even at first. I mean, it really took me a while. And I could have done so much better in my early years in law school if I had just given up on the Democratic Party. I mean, just the extent you can just give up on everything the Democrats believe in and oppose everything that they do, your life will become better. I mean, in some ways it won't. I mean, there's a lot of really good friends that I had and people I love. I mean, they're good people. They've just been hypnotized by these false ideals. I mean, fundamentally, I think that's, I don't know, what is the nature of the process? That's why I'm reading Oswald Spengler. That's what's key about this guy. This guy is another window, another tool in our kit for trying to understand what the fuck is going on around us. Why is all this shit happening? Why is this happening? Why is the United States of America becoming a joke? Like, fundamentally, isn't that the one question that's on your mind every day? Why is my country a joke? Why am I being exposed to degrading spectacles every day of my life? Why am I being told what to think and what to believe every day of my life? Why am I being lied to every day of my life? These are the questions you got to be asking yourself. And, I mean, maybe not. I mean, dude, to the extent you can, if you got the money and you can just go to the Caribbean and get away from it all, or if you can just, like, move to, like, Uruguay or something, fucking do it. Like, get out of here, man. Get out of here if you can. And, I mean, some people say, stand and fight. Hey, you know, I mean, I'd like to do that as well, or, you know, whatever. I mean, the second we actually fight, it would be a very dark place, and I don't want that. Nobody wants that, other than the freaking glowies and the freaking FBI and the freaking CIA and all these other just rapscallions. I mean, just rapscallions. And I say to these guys, please don't murder me. and to the extent that you need to, like, blackmail me or something, I say, love me gentle. So that's all I've got to say to the three-letter agencies. But beyond that, and beyond any other three-letter agencies from any other countries who may be paying Mad Air, I don't even know. This guy does have a Chinese wife, though. I've heard just as, like, idiotic things from a lot of other guys who have Chinese wives who, you know, I mean, we live in a neo-Marxist miasma. So a lot of people who aren't on the bankrolls of any sort of three-letter agency in any sort of country, any sort of cloak and dagger, man, that's what I fucking mean. You know, there's a lot of useful idiots out there. Virtually, Jesus, with these kids coming out of these schools, can you even call them schools anymore? I mean, that's another question. I mean, if you want to talk about a pseudo-morphosis, and I'm just riffing on this idea now, but, I mean, what does the word school mean anymore? I mean, what does it even freaking mean? It doesn't mean what it meant in 1787. I know that much. I mean, and obviously, because you didn't have public education then, or no. I mean, what a tremendous, it's just the greatest thing on earth that the government pays for schools for everybody, because now everybody can read, and everybody's reading all this good stuff. Everybody in the country is just so smart, because the government is running all these schools, and it's just like, I mean, haven't we progressed so much? I mean, we're just such a great, Anyway, so, you know, for people who actually want to learn, people who might not be in a school or in a government-run indoctrination center, and that's not even, I mean, George Carlin was saying that stuff, and, I mean, who knows what George Carlin was really into. I mean, he was a useful idiot, I think, at the end of the day. a very, very funny one, who I adore to a certain degree, but definitely, oh man, I mean, it just speaks to how far left I was in my teenage and 20s. But anyway, so I guess that about wraps it up. So let me review the 5 reasons I think anybody listening here should read Oswald Spengler, should watch some more videos about them, either here as I produce them, as I hope to, and or on John David Ebert's channel. Certainly a lot to get out of his discussion, and especially about art history. Again, I don't know that much about it, so it could just be kind of a Gell-Mann phenomenon. Murray Gell-Mann, he called it Gell-Mann amnesia, where, and it might have been Michael Crichton who actually coined the term, but where you read something in a newspaper that you actually know something about, and you're like, man, these guys are idiots. They don't know anything. They don't know anything. They don't know freaking anything. They don't know the causal relationships. They have everything upside down and backwards. And people read these things and they think they're actually getting knowledge. That is very scary. That is frightening. Anyway, so then you flip the page, and now it's an article that's about a subject that you don't know that much about. And you completely forget at that point that just the last article that you knew something about, they didn't know anything about. And he was completely stupid. But you read that next article as if they know what they're talking about. And I'm sorry to compare John David Ebert to that at all, because I don't think that's actually what's going on. But I'm just saying I don't know that much about art history. So it's not like kind of with some of the things he, like there's sometimes where John David Ebert's just discussing Spenglerian thought in just a very credulous manner, where you're just like, wait, you're not going to like at least even kind of express like the materialist kind of counter argument, or like a different argument about how this could have originated. I mean, there's just no, it's just like, well, so Spengler is like, I'll go more in depth on that in another one. But let's review the 5 reasons. So the first one is it's a breath of fresh air from the excessive materialism of our age. We need to rebalance to some degree. I mean, it's so clear as day. So many people are feeling it in the air. There's too much materialism on a philosophical level in our culture, and we're struggling to break out of it. I'm struggling to break out of it. It's very tough for me to have an authentic religiousness, to have an authentic spirituality. And the closest I may be able to get is this kind of idealism, and really kind of in the spirit of Gustave Le Bon, because his idealism, I think it's pretty rigorous, and it's very parsimonious, but powerful. Well, I guess parsimonious implies powerful as an analytical tool, and that's what's really important with a theory. And so the first reason, it's a breath of fresh air from excessive materialism. The corollary of that, or the caution I'll give you there, I don't think it's really a corollary, but the caution I'll give you there is, as you read Spengler, you might need a breath of fresh air from him, from a more materialist, more methodologically well-grounded, more perhaps humble, I don't know. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but there's just, yeah, there's a lot to the work, and it can become frustrating, but it's a great antidote. Or antidote is not. It's just a great breath of fresh air from the excessive materialism of our age. And if you'd like a shorter work that's perhaps an even better, fresh, kind of injection of much needed idealism into our framework, Gustave Le Bon or Ian McGilchrist are going to be your 2 guys there. The second point is the seeming accuracy of so many of Oswald Spengler's predictions. Very interesting. Now, is it his physiognomic system, his framework, that's really producing these and doing this that well? Is it just luck? Is it randomness? I don't know. But the fact that he's made these predictions and that 100 years later, they've, at this point, they look so prescient And it's not just one or two. I mean, there's, maybe a dozen, maybe 24 of these predictions that are just wow. So I think there's something to it, and that would be my second reason, and maybe that's the deepest, because, I'm an American. At the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, I'm an intellectual guy, as I hope might come through. I mean, I don't know. How much do you really want to come off as an intellectual in the modern world? But it's something that I value. And so, I'm certainly not a guy who's very strategic in my thinking and acquisitive and things like that. I certainly, with my legal background and my finance background, I probably should be out there making more money than I am, not spending my time on discussing these esoteric matters of German philosophy. But it's something I value quite highly. And I guess at the end of the day, though, I could never engage in the practice, even though I'm not really, obviously, for myself personally, my gain isn't here. I would gain so much more from so many other activities. But even though I'm not really getting kind of an instrumental or utilitarian benefit here, I get a psychic benefit. But and maybe this is a certain kind of philosopher I think would criticize this aspect of my philosophy. That, despite the fact I'm not the most practical person in my day-to-day life, if the philosophy doesn't have a practical upshot and if the philosophy doesn't help the person who is the adherent of the philosophy, or the philosophy doesn't predict results, or I think those are probably the two main criteria for me. But if it doesn't do those two things, and at least one of the two, it's completely worthless. I mean, what value is any system of thinking other than how it can benefit the individual adherent or their society, right? Because for a guy like Le Bon or a guy like Spengler, I think, God, that was such a butchered mix of pronunciations there, but certainly for Le Bon, the idea has this kind of congealing or cohesive force, the pursuit of a common ideal. And maybe that's the mechanism by which these cultures grow, and it's consonant with the Spenglerian thought. So that's a benefit that a philosophy could have. And maybe that's the benefit that any philosophy could have. And you could make an analogy to picking a side of the road to drive on, right? Is the American way correct on the right side, or is the British way on the left side correct? It doesn't matter. As long as you pick one side and everybody goes on it, you're perfectly fine. And maybe that's the idea with a cohesive ideology or a cohering ideology, or whatever the best way to describe this is, an ideology that's supposed to bring the society together in a in some direction of attainment towards some sort of goal, or some sort of horizontal ideal that can never truly be reached. So maybe it doesn't even matter what the underlying ideal is, so long as it has those properties that can make it something that will bring the people together. So I'm open to those ideas, but that's always going to be like a religious, an idea in the nature of a religion, not in the nature of a philosophy. If we're doing philosophy, it has to be all about the intellect. I mean, at the end of the day, and you've got great things from guys like John Vervaeke talking about the 5 Ps, or is it the 4 Ps? I think of knowing, right? So you've got the propositional, and that's where most philosophy is gonna occur, and so and that's what Spengler really criticized, and that's what Vervaeke criticizes, and almost anybody can kind of intuit this in the modern day. These people who just focus on propositions and don't focus on any other aspect of human knowledge gaining. So the others are participatory, and that I don't quite understand how different that is from the procedural. And the procedural is more, makes more sense to me. That's more like technical knowledge, maybe arete, you might to some degree say, techne maybe it's more like techne. So you got, and then the perspectival, and that, okay, I get that. I mean, you can't truly understand a perspective until you're really in it, right? But anyway, at the end of the day, I mean, philosophy is going to have to lean pretty hard on the propositional. And in my view, the best way, I mean, you've got to have some way to check it, right? You've got to have some way to test these hypotheses. I mean, and you're saying, well, it's philosophy, it's not science, but, there's got to be some level of quasi-empiricism, even if you can't, use the full panoply of kind of empirical methods. You've still got to, I mean, what are the possible other, I think there's only three, right? It's either its value as a cohesive, a cohesive force, something like that. Its benefit to the adherent of the philosophy, that's the key benefit. I mean, virtually with any of these, like, that's really the key, is does this idea help my life or does this idea hinder my life? And that's one reason I might give you some caution about this book is, it's really not a nihilistic message, this kind of cyclical, organismic, morphological interpretation of history. It's not truly nihilistic, and it's not really pessimistic on a deep level. But it's very easy to read it that way because we are in a phase that's not the fun phase of a civilization. Not really. I mean, it kind of is, right? We have material wealth, and there's a lot of great things about that. I mean, it's nothing to sneeze, to turn your nose up at, but I don't know. So anyway, now, Grand Theory of History, that's the third reason you should read that book, because you got to be careful with it, as I've said throughout this thing, but it's a hell of a thing. And then the fourth reason, the unique terminology and the methodology, that's going to expand your mind to the extent you don't take it all hook, line, and sinker. Any new grand theory, meta-narrative, whatever you want to call it, any new such system that you encounter, if you take it in hook, line, and sinker, and you make it into a monolith, you make it into the exclusive method for pursuing truth, it's going to have a negative impact on you, almost certainly. Almost certainly. If it's defined with any lower level of generality. Now, there is some high level of generality where, yeah, maybe that is the full panoply, this full methodology that you are going to use. But, if we're talking about a specific method, it cannot be exclusive. And that's a weakness here, I think. I'll dig into those matters in another video. But very important, if you can engage with it without believing it all. This is the important thing, I think, and it's something we need to train more and more young Americans about, engaging with ideas without taking them on hook, line, and sinker. And maybe Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler can be an exercise for a lot of people that can lead them in a positive way on that path. And the final reason, the importance of history as a concept in German idealisms. And German idealisms, you don't like them, you think they're esoteric, you think they're abstruse, which they are, and and they're worthless. There's not insignificant arguments that they are worthless, that they're worse than worthless. They're negative sum philosophies, and there's a lot of problems with them. And these guys can say whatever they want about England, and they can say whatever they want about America. But our systems just work better, and that's the thing. I mean, these just constant smear campaigns that the English-speaking world wages against itself. So we don't need any help from the French or the Germans, not to mention the Chinese or the Russians. But these self-hating currents in our culture are just. These people, if you hate yourself and your country so much, you know what you can do. You know what you can do, and I'm not urging you to, but you know what you can do, okay? So maybe shut up. I don't know. Just consider it, to the extent you can consider anything. Because if you're an American who's anti-American, you are not a smart person. That's just fundamentally something very bad happened in your life. And it might not have been, some sensational thing where, I can realize that something really bad happened to me. But I'm telling you, if your thought is so immature and undeveloped and stunted and deranged and perverted that you think the United States of America, in its best form, in a truly constitutional form, which, as I say, Spengler correctly predicted that we're actually not even there anymore. Does America as actually a true America exist? I don't know. That's probably a no true Scotsman fallacy. But, to the extent you grow up in this country, you enjoy all these benefits. Many of them, are they earned? Are they unearned? I don't know. For instance, our tremendous advantage with seniorage. Now, what's seniorage? In the most general sense, seniorage is the advantage of the sovereign by being able to create fiat currency. Initially, seniorage refers just to the value of a minted coin, the delta between its value and the underlying bullion within it. Because once you make that a coin, it's more valuable because it's more portable, it's easier to tell the value, things like that. So that's originally it. But now you look at a dollar bill today, it's all seniorage because that paper itself has no value. So we have this huge advantage of seniorage, and why does the United States have the biggest advantage? Because the dollar is the global reserve currency, this always creates a demand for dollars. So if you're watching guys like Brent Johnson, Diego Parilla, these guys, that was kind of butchered on Parilla there. I couldn't get that double R with the double L. He's got a brilliant name, though. I wish I could pronounce it real well for you right now, because it's a beautiful name. And he's a very smart guy. Brent Johnson, Diego Parilla. I'm not hitting that tonight. And they've, there's a kind of dollar milkshake theory, guys, and that's all founded on inexhaustible demand for the U.S. dollar because it's a numeraire currency. And so we've got advantages like that, and is it earned, is it unearned? I don't know. Would you prefer it if the Nazis had won World War II? To the extent you would, well, then it is unearned. To the extent you don't, to the extent you're at all grateful for the sacrifices that many good Americans made in World War II, in the wars that followed, well, perhaps you do think it's earned. Certainly the individuals alive today did not earn it. It was earned by, Yankee muscle once upon a time. Now, how much muscle does a Yankee have anymore? A very sad tale, one could tell. But let's not dwell on the negative. Anyway, so to the extent you want to understand real history, and that, I don't know, I'm not going to preach at you guys. I'm sure, I don't know. Anybody who could actually listen to everything I've said so far and is with me, I don't know. I'm sure I've lost many people by now. Every video would by this point. And probably particularly with, a guy who is very bearish on the future of American German idealism. otherwise known as wokeism. And that's really a broad way to put it. I mean, that's not the precise and best way to put it. But it is fundamentally a perverted German idealism, because you have the first perversion with the Marxian inversion. I mean, these guys are all con men. But, anyway, so it's all a bunch of bullshit. To the extent these people actually believe anything that they're saying, they're hypnotized by the idea, or they're just not smart at all. To the extent they're using it in an instrumental way, they are psychopaths, or probably better said, sociopaths. I mean, it depends on that all depends on their attitude towards their enemies. So the more vicious, the more likely they're a psychopath. The less vicious and the more strictly instrumental, the more likely that they're merely a sociopath. So anyway, reviewing for a final time what I have said. The first reason, a breath of fresh air from the excessive materialism of this very superficial age we live in. Second reason, the seeming accuracy of his predictions. This guy gets so many things right. Why is he getting them right? Does he have a good methodology? What parts of his methodology are leading him to these seemingly correct predictions? Obviously the final bell hasn't rung on anything, but there's a lot of evidence in support of this guy's opinions. The third point, it's a grand theory of history. We need to be able to deal with grand theories, meta-narratives. We need to be able to deal with them maturely, okay? We can't dismiss them out of hand, but we can accept them hook, line, and sinker, lock, stock, and barrel. Fuck that. So, number 4, the unique terminology and methodology. Let's really understand these idiosyncratic uses of words that Spengler and his translator Atkinson make. Is this terminology helpful? Is it merely jargon? Are there certain concepts that he should just jettison because his argument would be stronger? These are the big questions to me. Number 5, the importance of history, capital H history, as a concept in German idealism, dialectical materialism, the demonic, incredibly stupid and immature philosophy that is continuing to harm our world and to harm the United States. And, that's what I'm saying is, to the extent you do any of your bullshit in any other country, or, if you do it outside of the Americas, okay, maybe. But to the extent any of this stuff happens in the United States, Canada, or Latin America, I've got major fucking problems with it. And these people, we need to understand how they think. These paralogies. Parology, it's a big word. It's a false logic. Or basically, it's a false logic. It's a logic that doesn't really work. But it's believed by a community of thinkers. And, thinkers, just a community. To the extent that each human being is a thinking being. But not a lot of thought is certainly going to go on in most of these places. I can assure you of that. And so it's just good to understand that. And this is the German idealist work that's really trying to define history in probably the most rigorous way and the most interesting way. So those are the 5 reasons that I'll leave you with to dig into Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes. And I hope that you will find it to be a very insightful. I think there's a lot of insight. Stimulating. I think is the one adjective that describes it more than anything. It is a stimulating work. And I hope that it will stimulate you to think further, to the extent any of my words have stimulated you to think further about any matter. I would be very thankful for that. And I thank you so much for your time and your patience with this video. And I hope to God that you have gotten something very positive out of it. To the extent you have not, I have failed in my task, and for that I apologize. With that being said, have yourselves a merry little evening. Best wishes. Pierce. Peace.